Hello and good evening. My name is Daniel Cunningham. I am a horticulturist with Rooted In, and we are pleased, along with my colleagues at Rooted In and our colleagues at Water is Awesome, to present comprehensive lawn care, where we are going to dig deeper into some of the benefits of growing a lush, vibrant lawn, as well as how we can do that with more sustainable practices. We'll have time for questions after tonight's presentation. But if you think of something, whether it's tonight, 2 weeks from now, 2 years from now, we would love to connect on social media, and you can find us at RootedInTX, both on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, but also you can connect with Rooted In on LinkedIn and YouTube as well. Now, I wanted to It says my screen sharing is paused. Move this window away from shared application. I'm so sorry. I clicked forward and for some reason it said
I'm
that.
still I'm still seeing your screen. You might just have to reshare.
Okay, sorry guys. This new fandangled technology I was sharing and it started getting something on the screen blinking that says it wasn't seeing it. But thank you, Heather.
It's all right. I
So
can see it
again,
now.
you've been introduced to Heather now. She is with the wonderful folks at Water is Awesome, our wonderful sponsors this evening. And they've really got a lot of information on their website that I would encourage you to go and check out. And we'll be digging more into that later, kind of as we progress. You may even actually want to open another browser and check out some of the resources. One of those is our guide that goes along with tonight's class, titled Comprehensive Lawn Care. In fact, if you look on, for me, it's on the right side of the screen. There's a PDF, kind of where you ask questions there, and you can download that file directly to your computer, and it goes in depth about all the subjects that we'll talk about this evening, and you can kind of follow along there. Also, you can find that at waterisawesome.com, along with many of the other handouts that we've developed with some of the other classes we've taught this year. Now, most of those classes and those handouts, I've developed different ways that we can overcome the challenges to gardening, especially here in North Central Texas, where we're just coming off the summer months. We had a mild summer, but one of those challenges that our lawn does have to contend with is heat, and not just air temperatures, but also soil temperatures. We'll dig in more about some of the challenges as specifically as it relates to turf grass, sunlight, the quantity and quality. We'll talk about the limitations to growing turf grass in our area and what turf grass we can grow in what sunlight conditions. Something good to think about. We'll also be talking about weeds. Weeds compete with our lawns for not only water, but sunlight and nutrients as well. But we want to make sure that when we're controlling weeds, not only are we being effective at controlling them, but if we are putting any chemical-based products on our landscape, whether those are synthetic or organic, that we're doing that in a way that is not going to hurt our plant material or our lawn in this case, but also that it's not going to run off of our landscapes and cause problems in our nearby waterways. And so that's something to also think about. We'll also dig into common insect or pest insect problems that we see in lawns. Most of those you're probably already familiar with. And then one of the main things we will focus on here at the beginning of this class is getting the right amount of water to our lawns. And that is a challenge that most people face, whether it's overwatering, which can contribute to pest and disease problems, or underwatering, which can cause our turf grass to struggle, and then maybe some of those weeds actually come in and take control. We want to make sure that we're delivering the right amount of water to our landscapes at the right time, but making sure that that is going to be effective, that the water is actually going to the root zone where our lawns can use it. And so a lot of good stuff, I think. If we look at north central Texas, it's kind of a bird's eye view. Really, the dominant species we see, especially in most of the new neighborhoods, is going to be turf grass. And in fact, many developers, because it is relatively inexpensive, will put up to 90% of the landscape in lawn area. And while that may be beneficial for some reasons that we'll dig into, it also creates some challenges. In fact, you may be surprised to learn that the four largest crops in the United States by acreage are corn, soybeans, and wheat, and then lawn is kind of bringing up the rear there. So uh, the first thing that we mentioned are agricultural crops that we're actually getting something out. We're fertilizing them. We're putting different pesticides and insecticides out there, and we're getting something in return, food. But with lawns, unless you have a pet goat or a pet rabbit, you're probably not getting a lot of return on your investment other than just a usable outdoor space. And so we want to make sure that although lawns can be intensive in terms of water needs and chemical needs, that we are going to be as efficient with those as possible. That's going to save us money, but it's also just better for our environment in the long run. In fact, NASA shows that turf grass is the largest irrigated crop in the country, which is really kind of remarkable when you think about it. So, a lot of times there's this stigma of lawns as being water hogs. They don't necessarily have to be. If we water infrequently and deeply, we can actually encourage a deeper root system for our lawns. That makes them more heat tolerant, more drought resistant. And so, if you are watering frequently, what that does tend to create a shallower root zone, or the majority of the roots are going to hang out closer to the top of the soil. But if you can just taper that off a little bit and encourage those deeper root systems, lawns can be more resilient than a lot of people think. Now, overuse of different amendments that we're putting on the landscape, whether that's fertilizers and pesticides or other chemicals, they can lead to water pollution if they are managed the wrong way rather. But we want to focus on the right way this evening. If we go back and imagine what grasses look like in our areas 100 or 200 years ago, there were grasses that dominated the landscape, a little bit different grasses mostly. We'll talk about one of them tonight. There's Bessie the bison, and we imagine, if she was feeding on her field of grass and wildflowers, let's say there's some blue graham in there and some curly mesquite, and maybe some buffalo grass and little blue stem, things like that. Well, when it actually rained, those grasses and forbs would slow down the infiltration of water, where up to 50% of the water that fell from the sky would actually enter the ground, delivered to those root zones. About 10% would go as runoff to nearby creeks and rivers. And then about 40% would be lost to evaporation. That's going to reseed clouds or the next storm. Now, we planted a city. That city needs roads and parking lots. And as that city begins to grow, now when it rains, in an average 1-inch rainfall event, only 15% of the water can actually infiltrate the soil. And the reason that is because we have all these impervious surfaces. So when a raindrop hits the roof of a building, the sidewalk, the driveway, the roads, the concrete, then it's going to go with the path of least resistance, and that begins what we call runoff. And you know, because that runoff is in an urban area, we tend to see a lot of pollutants that go with that water. The runoff is not only increased quantity than it was 200 years ago, but it's decreased quality and it moves with greater speed. That's why we hear turn around, don't drown all the time, because the path as it goes, the path of water goes with the path of least resistance. And so those low-lying areas tend to flood because there's no other places for those water drops to go if they can't go into the soil. So they're picking up different fertilizers and pesticides, different pathogens, when they are running off those hard surfaces, impervious or impermeable surfaces. And so that's something that we do want to address because it affects our water quality. The water that we get from our lawns actually comes from our nearby lakes and reservoirs, and we want to make sure that we keep that as clean as possible, not just for the fish in our lakes and the wildlife that use that water, and people who recreational uses like to go to the lake, but also it's just easier for us to clean that water to deliver it to your landscape if it's not polluted, in the first place. But one of the reasons why it's increasingly important is because we live in not only one of the fastest growing areas in the state of Texas, but also in the country, with estimates of 51 million people will be in the state of Texas by 2070. Another estimates up to 54 million people. And so it's like if you thought traffic was bad now, I don't know what it's going to be like then. In fact, it was a meme, and I think it gave me a little chuckle. It may is not be that funny, but they said, can we go back to the part of COVID where there was no traffic? It seems like now that traffic is back up to where it was and then some. And part of that is a sign that we have a larger growing population. A lot of folks are moving here, and we have pretty much the same water supplies. We do have two new lakes coming on board, and we're very excited about those. But all in all, our water supplies are going to decrease over that same time period. And so, because of aging infrastructure and sedimentation in lakes, and just the challenges of maintaining that infrastructure that is so critical, there are predictions that supply would actually decrease at the same time that the demand is going to increase. And so, one of the ways that we can overcome that challenge is just by being more effective and more efficient with the water that we do use. We're not saying we don't want to use water at all in our lawns. Certainly we do, but we want to make sure that it's going on our lawns and not running down the sidewalk, and that we're actually watering at the right time so the lawn can take full advantage. Now, that creates more of a challenge when we do run into a drought. And if you're familiar with the weather patterns here in north central Texas, at any given year we could experience drought, whether that's drought in the winter, but it creates a bigger challenge when there's a drought during the growing season and the lakes aren't filling up as fast as we're using that water. Then we're into watering guidelines that only allow us to water once a week, or other parts of the country have gone into drought restrictions where they can't actually water their landscapes at all. So it behooves us as gardeners to try and taper off that water, excuse me, when we are seeing drought periods, so that can last us until the next rainfall event. So it just kind of makes sense. And we'll talk about some other ways we can save water. I promise I'll get off my water saving soapbox here, but what I really wanted to do is just to encourage folks that if there's in this tonight's presentation, if you see like, oh, this is a change that I can do that's easy, that's going to save me on my water bill, it's going to be healthier for my turf grass. Well, if you do that and your neighbor does that and your neighbor's neighbor does that, well, then collectively it's better for our community. So if we can prevent pollution going down the curb inlet in our storm drain that's running off of our landscape, to be fertilizers or herbicides, anything like that, and just do a better job of saving water and protecting our water supplies, then our whole community gets that benefit. So it really just kind of makes sense. So read the labels if you're using anything in your lawn. Make sure you're applying it effectively. That's going to save you money in the long run, but also it just will be better for our nearby creeks. One thing that we can do too, especially as it's related to turf grass, and this is one of my jobs. Every other day, I've got to go back. We have two dogs, and clean up after those dogs. One of the largest contributors to stormwater pollution is fecal bacteria from cats and dogs. It's kind of gross to talk about, but it's even more gross when we think about that ending up in our nearby creek and our lake, again, which is where we get our drinking water from. So keep that in mind. There's certainly advantages to a healthy lawn, and that's one of the things that we really want to dig into a little bit deeper tonight. Aesthetically, they're more attractive for sure. If you look at a front lawn that is green, it actually can increase your home's value. It also creates usable outdoor space for living and recreation. So whether that's kicking a soccer ball or playing with your kids on a swing, or playing with your dogs, letting your dogs go outside and use the restroom. Certainly lawns have their benefits. They can also reduce dust and air pollution from the air. Now, they're probably not as effective as doing it as like the small mixed grass prairie that we talked about earlier, but when compared to those driveways and sidewalks and maybe it's concrete patios, definitely they do a better job of kind of cooling our spaces and cleaning the air as also compared to just dirt or bare soil, in addition to reducing energy use for heating and cooling. So, just vegetation in general does a good job of buffering the heat island effect that we've heard about so often in urban areas. Excuse me. And then there's also reduced erosion. So, if you had, maybe an area where there wasn't vegetation or you weren't watering at all and your turf grass was struggling, we'd start to see spots of more bare soil. And that's actually not what we want either, because that bare soil ends up in our creeks and eventually in our lakes. So, I wanted to open up just talking a little bit about turf grass selection. Now, if you are selecting a turf grass for your property, or maybe you're just reevaluating the turf grass that you do have, you want to look at your lawn areas and see how much sunlight you have. Generally, turf grass needs at least 5 to 6 hours in order to thrive. And you may see areas where turf grass is kind of hanging on with less than that. But really, to establish new turf grass, or really for turf grass to be successful, you need to have at least 5 to 6 hours, even for our shade tolerant turf varieties. So look around your house and see, areas specifically underneath trees or areas that are shaded by fences or buildings. If they're not getting at least 5 to 6 hours, you may see them start to recede in less dense turf and more of those bare soil areas. You also want to do an inventory about how much foot traffic you would get. So if you have a big dog, or maybe you have a few kids that try and run and play in the backyard, especially in the areas where they're concentrated, you may see compacted areas where the turf grass is no longer thriving. And there are some turf grasses that do a little bit better with foot traffic, and some that struggle a little bit. I promise, before I started this presentation, I had a water and I misplaced it, so bear with me. Soil type is also a factor. So you may have heavy clays that are compacted, or you may have sandy soils that create their own set of challenges, and different turf grasses can withstand different soil types. Our area is dominated by heavy clay soils. Even if you have a sandy layer on top, the soil tends to be more alkaline, although there are some pockets where it's more acidic throughout the landscape. But most of the time, if you're putting new sod down, or you're planting a new turf grass, and you want to kind of start from scratch, you would actually bring in a sandy loam or bring in compost and incorporate that into your soil, just because if the soil's healthier, then your turf grass lawn can be more resilient to anything that North Texas climate throws our way. The maintenance requirements are also different. So we talk about maintenance, it's running a mower. Some turf grass you actually have to mow a little bit more frequently. Some turf grass you may have to irrigate a little bit more frequently. You may have to apply fertilizers a little bit more frequently. So we want to make sure that if you are planting, especially one of those really fine bladed turf grass, that you're willing to put up with the increased maintenance that is going to keep your lawn looking its best. Now, if you from the get go are like, I am done maintaining a pristine lawn, I want something that will look better without additional maintenance, then there are some other turf grasses that you may want to look into. And I mentioned a maintenance, but water is certainly one of those. Some of our turf grasses can go weeks and months without irrigations, where other ones need more regular or frequent irrigation during the periods when it's not raining. And that's really the key point there. Now, when you talk about turf grass in North Texas, we can grow the warm season turf grasses more effectively here. And really, it's the only species that I would recommend. You're probably familiar with St. Augustine. It is the dominant turf grass species in north central Texas. It just means it's planted more often, generally because it's the cheapest. and it's the one that many builders will put in first. There's also Bermuda grass as well. We'll learn about all the ins and outs of those. Those are well adapted to our area, but provide some challenges. Buffalo grass is actually the only turf grass we'll talk about tonight that is actually indigenous to Dallas County. In fact, it would naturally grow in areas in kind of the short mixed grass prairie, but it would grow with a lot of other species kind of together with it. It wasn't necessarily a monoculture. And so turf scientists have bred buffalo grass to grow lower and more dense and to not produce seed hedge, which some people see as unsightly. And so, if you're looking for extremely low maintenance lawn area, buffalo grass may be an option. Then zoysia grass is kind of the new kid on the block. It's been around for about 30 years or so here in the United States. Used a lot of them look very similar to St. Augustine. Others can look kind of closer to some of our cool season grasses, Kentucky bluegrass. But it is very resilient to heat and drought and has some benefits that I think make it more desirable than some of the other turf grasses that we're used to. Now, there are two different species of zoysia grasses. One of those at the bottom of the screen is going to be a finer leaf blade. You'll see this on golf fairways. You'll see it sometimes used on adjacent sports fields where they don't really get a lot of heavy traffic. But it is something that looks more like a finer leaf, sports turf, but it tends to have more of an emerald green look to it versus like Bermuda grass, let's say. Then there are also the thicker bladed zoysia grasses that we see on kind of the top right of the screen, and that's actually what's pictured on the top left as well. This is Palisades. Many people call this one baby St. Augustine because it has a little bit of a wider leaf blade. Now, it's a smaller grass in general, and so even though in this picture you may think that looks like St. Augustine, it's actually about half as thick, the leaf blade, as St. Augustine grass, but it does pretty well at handling foot traffic. It actually recovers from injury fairly well. You don't have to mow it as frequently. You don't have to fertilize it as frequently. So I would say for 70-80% of homeowners, the thicker bladed zoysia grasses are going to be the better option, where the finer bladed zoysia grasses, many people use a reel mower to keep them at kind of their optimum. Sometimes they can have problem with accumulation of thatch or any of the dead material kind of building on there. And so if you like the finer blades, you're going to get an extra maintenance requirement. If you're okay with the thicker bladed zoysias, then it really is a great low maintenance option, especially when compared to St. Augustine. And one of the reasons why is because unfortunately, most of the St. Augustine cultivars have a greater disease problems, especially when we see really wet years. So if we have a stretch where it's raining multiple times a week for a month with St. Augustine, you're going to have fungal problems, but the zoysia grasses tend to be resilient to those same issues. So just some of the benefits there. I mentioned buffalo grass. Buffalo grass is, and I should go back a slide. I missed this one. I'll show another slide too that talks more about this. But one more thing, wrapping up zoysia, is it grows anywhere from about 5 hours of sunlight to full sun. So it can really kind of handle the gamut. It can handle the lower end of the spectrum, but again, all of our warm season turf grasses need at least 5 hours of sunlight in order to thrive, zoysia being one of those. Buffalo grass needs at least 7 or so hours of sunlight in order to thrive. So if you want buffalo grass and you only get 5 or 6 hours of sunlight, it's not going to be the best option there. Now, if you were okay, mixing some turf grass species, there's some blends that have blue graham in them. Maybe they could handle, 6.5 to 7 hours of sunlight, but for the most part, buffalo grass is a full sun turf grass. Now, the benefits you get with that is most of our warm season turf grasses are going to go completely dormant during the winter, at least in most years. So they're going to turn blonde we say instead of going blonde for the summer, they're going blonde for the winter. But buffalo grass, if we went a stretch where we didn't see much of any rainfall for a month, it actually has the ability, it's called drought avoidance, but it can go dormant in the summer. And then after we get a heavy rainfall event, it greens that back up relatively quickly. So there is that benefit. The other benefit is that it's a relatively slow grower. It doesn't need a lot of nitrogen or fertilization. So it's pretty, resilient where we don't have to mow it frequently. We don't have to add a lot of fertilizer. So in terms of lower maintenance turf, you really can't get as low maintenance as buffalo grass. In fact, with buffalo grass, it's lower maintenance than artificial turf, in fact. Bermuda grass is another option. Now, Bermuda grass is indigenous to Africa. It is used to extreme heat and extreme drought. There are a number of different cultivars that have been bred, excuse me, to grow very low, very tight. It does a good job of outcompeting weeds. In fact, Bermuda grass in itself may be one of the most challenging weeds in the vegetable garden, especially those seeding varieties like the common Bermuda grass. It just kind of gets out of control because it is a very vigorous plant for our area. Now, most of the cultivars that would grow in a lawn setting have actually been bred to not produce a lot of seed heads, if any. They've also been bred to grow very thick to outcompete those weeds. They also handle foot traffic better than most every grass. Now, if there is a downside, then again, you need at least 7+ hours of sunlight in order for these to thrive. That is, one of the things. It will not handle the part shade areas like the zoysia grass or the St. Augustine will. Um, because it handles foot traffic a little bit better, it also tends to require a little bit more nitrogen to recover. So you're probably going to have to fertilize your Bermuda grass a little bit more than you would some of the other species we've talked about. Now, this one again is St. Augustine. I mentioned it, but the thickest leaf blade of anything we've shown so far. Now, this picture is actually showing that it's growing in relatively low light conditions. Now, these are Bradford pears, so kind of a undesirable tree for our area that grows very, very fast. Fast growing tree is typically a fast dying tree, which is the problem with these. But to the point, those trees were put in at the same time as the St. Augustine lawn. So as those trees grew, they began to shade out the lawn, but the root zone of the lawn was already established and its runners were already established. And so it's kind of has already a vigorous root system, which tends to be more resilient to shade. If you tried to plant St. Augustine sod in this area, you would more than likely not be successful. Where sometimes people can be successful in low light conditions is if the shade grew with the turf grass. If you're trying to establish new sod in the shade, it is very, very challenging. So that's why we would encourage people to grow in more than 5 hours of sunlight area for our St. Augustine and our zoysia grasses, where of course the buffalo and the Bermuda grass really couldn't handle that at all. One thing you will notice with St. Augustine is is how it grows in comparison to the orientation of your home. So this side of the home, we're actually looking on the south side, and because of the way the sun is positioned, that's going to get the majority of the sunlight. Sometimes behind the trees on the north side of the trunk, you'll always see a little bit of a bald spot there, and I know a little something about bald spots myself. But the reason that is because the sunlight really doesn't get a good angle on the north side of trees and buildings. And so, even though that area may get a little bit of morning sunlight, it may get a little bit of evening sunlight. During the day, it's not going to get a lot of sunlight. So, behind trees in this situation, you'd always see a little bald spot. So, there's really not anything you can do, say, from cutting limbs off a tree. And certainly, that's not something we don't want to sacrifice our tree for the health of our lawn. We'd actually would prefer all the benefits that a tree can provide. So what you may actually want to do is if you had St. Augustine that was struggling in low light conditions, is actually bring your bed into those bare soil areas and plant shade tolerant flowers and shrubs and maybe even ground covers rather than trying to plant new sod or overwatering, over fertilizing. That's what we see so often is people will have turf grass that is struggling because of low light conditions, and they try and over fertilize it and overwater it, and that actually speeds up the decline. If you over fertilize, and we'll touch on this in another section, but that encourages new growth, and that new growth tends to be more susceptible to pest and disease. If you over apply water, then the longer the leaf blades on the grass stay wet, then they're more susceptible to fungal problems, which we especially see in St. Augustine. So, really the best thing is, if you don't have at least 5 hours of sunlight, is to plant a ground cover in those spots. Now, this kind of everything we talked about, this kind of breaks it down so you can compare the different warm season turf grasses that grow in our area. You can see shade tolerance as we kind of grow grow through there. St. Augustine and zoysia would have a moderate shade tolerance. We go through, the sunlight requirement. You can see that Bermuda grass and buffalo grass are going to have a higher requirement. Mowing frequency, because Bermuda grass tends to be the most vigorous and handle foot traffic, it also may need to be mowed a little bit more frequently. In fact, if you're waiting 10 days to 2 weeks to mow your Bermuda grass, it may actually go downhill, or the quality may be reduced there. So pay attention with that. The rest of them you can mow, every week or so, and then buffalo grass you can even mow once a month during the growing season and be fine with that. Mowing height, everyone likes different types of turf grasses. Many people like turf grasses on the shorter end. On the shorter end, we would deter people from cutting any lower than 2 inches, because those turf grass areas tend to be more susceptible to heat stress and drought stress. So if we can actually have a little bit more top growth, that can help kind of shade the soil, but also it encourages a deeper root zone, especially during the growing season. Where buffalo grass, you don't actually have to mow it. You can let it, it'll naturally kind of top out depending on the cultivar. This says 8 inches. Some is like 609. Some of the newer cultivars of buffalo grass only get up to 6 inches tall. So kind of looks like a little bit of a prairie, but not too wild looking. You can see, if you do have big dogs and kids, resistance to foot traffic, Bermuda grass is high. Your zoysia grasses are moderate to high, and then buffalo grass and St. Augustine are kind of just in the middle zone. They can handle some foot traffic, but if you did have big dogs running back and forth, or kids, what I would probably do is the areas they most frequently traffic, to put mulched areas or gravel or something for them to actually run on that is not turf. Sometimes you'll see, like, as the dog runs back and forth to bark at the mailman or bark at the the trash truck, that's areas where mulch is a better option. Look at disease resistance. So because buffalo grass evolved in our harsh and unpredictable climate, it has a relatively high disease tolerance, where St. Augustine has a relatively low disease tolerance. In fact, we see more fungal problems in St. Augustine than any other grasses. And you can kind of compare, the Bermuda and the zoysias are moderate to high. They can get some problems, but typically those aren't a major issues. And then water may be important to some. So zoysia grasses can range from the moderate to high St. Augustine, low to moderate buffalo grass, very low, and Bermuda grass is low. So just something to think on there if you were going to select a new turf grass. Now, you may already have a turf grass lawn that you like, and so what we want to do is help you keep it at its optimum color, its optimal growth to resist drought and heat, and be able to resist weed pressure. In fact, one of the best things that we can do to deter weeds is actually to keep our turf grass growing relatively thick and healthy, and then it will outcompete our weedy species. And so part of that is irrigation. Irrigation is the most limiting factor to plant growth. We want to make sure we're not over applying water, but we are applying water when we need to, just to kind of keep the plant alive to the next rainfall event. In fact, up to 70% of all water used by residential customers is applied to the landscape here in the growing season in central Texas. And so the main point there is that we only need to run our irrigation system when it's not raining. If you set it and forget it on your irrigation controller, if it's going off, for how long on your watering days, and no matter what, then that actually can not only be detrimental to your water bill, it can create too high of a water bill, but if it's overwatering, especially your St. Augustine, but even your other species, you may be contributing to more fungal problems. We don't want the wheat leaves to stay wet. We want the root zone to actually deeper in the root zone to hold moisture. So the most common irrigation problem we see not just in turf grass, but in interior plants, exterior plants, is overwatering. Another problem we see is improper design and installation of an irrigation system. And so if you have an in-ground irrigation system that is 20 or 30 years old, or maybe that it was installed by someone who was just saying they had the skills to install an irrigation system, but they weren't a licensed irrigator, we could start to see some issues. We also see improper scheduling practices, and I see this in my neighborhood, and I see it, pretty much every time it rains as I drive through the metroplex. But what we want is our sprinkler systems to run first thing in the morning on our watering day. Again, only if our turf grass needs water. But we don't want to water on windy days. We don't want to water after 10 o'clock in the morning. Um, Although we can irrigate past 6 o'clock in the evening per our watering guidelines, I wouldn't encourage it for St. Augustine species, especially because if a turf grass has water on the leaf blades, as you can kind of see in this picture, then fungus, different fungi will send out their spores in the evening. And if the spores land on a wet leaf blade, they're more susceptible to actually, take root and that disease to further spread. So for the most part, we would like to irrigate our turfgrass lawns in the morning, unless you have a large zone with many, or large system with many zones. Perhaps you may need to water a little bit in the evening. For the most part, water in the morning as much as possible, and definitely not if it has rained. If it just rained a couple days ago, there's probably no need to run your sprinkler system. If rain is in the forecast, if it's your watering day Tuesday, and there's rain, like there's a good chance of rain, a 50+% chance of rain on Wednesday, it would be silly to water. One, because on our heavy clay soils, the soil can only absorb so much water. So if you ran your sprinkler system and then it rained, the root zone would already be saturated. So we'd see most of that water actually just run right off the top. And that contributes to flooding problems that we don't want to see. And that affects us all. The other problem with that, though, is that if we, let's say that it rained and then we were to water, then we'd actually be running our irrigation system over saturated soil, and then the water that we're paying for is actually just running off the sidewalk and causing issues. So, if at all possible, we want to let Mother Nature do the watering, and then in between kind of those drought periods, if it hasn't rained in 7 to 10 days, then irrigation may be required. We'll talk about some ways to, that's kind of no brainer, some resources that will help you know when to water and when to wait. The other problem we see irrigating turf grass is no routine maintenance in your irrigation system. So your irrigation system may consist of your arm and a hose and then some type of hose and sprinkler. We want to make sure that there's no leaks in that line, and that we're maintaining it and being effective. We're delivering the water where the plants can actually take it up. But if you have an in-ground irrigation system, you should probably run it on test, or run it in the morning when you're up with a cup of coffee, and just make sure there are no major leaks. You may also just check your water bill and say, hey, is this something out of the ordinary? Why did it go up 20, $30, $50, what have you? And then you can make some adjustments to make sure that there are no leaks and the water is actually going where it's supposed to be going. But they do require some maintenance. Definitely in the season, like early on in the season, like March, I would run your system And even in March, we're probably getting regular rainfall, spring rains, where you won't need to run your system a lot, but just run it to test to make sure that it's doing well. So when we do get into May, June, July, when it gets hotter, that it's running optimally. Irrigation best management practices as it relates to turf grass and your entire landscape: water only when required. So if the soil is moist, you don't actually need to be irrigating. You can get a soil moisture meter. A lot of events, they actually hand these out for free. Most of your local nurseries are going to have these for $5 to $7. We actually sell these at rootedin.com if you wanted to buy them there. If you don't want to purchase one, you can actually use a screwdriver. And a screwdriver, if you stick it, you try and stick it in the ground and there's a lot of resistance and the top of the soil is dry, then that may mean that the soil is in need of some extra irrigation. If you put the screwdriver in and it goes all the way down, 7, 8 inches in there, when you pull it up and it's wet, and you can tell that there's wet soil lower in the profile, then you probably don't need to irrigate at all. But that soil moisture meter actually has a sensor on there, and if it's in the moist zone, then you're good to go. You don't need to run your irrigation system. And I mentioned this earlier, but it's always better to water infrequently and deeply to promote deep and healthy roots. So the turf grass on the left, we actually only water when the lower root zone starts to dry out. If we do that, the water kind of evaporates typically from the top of the soil down, and that will encourage those roots to tap into the soil moisture lower in the profile. That makes them more heat tolerant, more drought tolerant, more resistant to stress in general. The turf grass on the right, if we just water a little bit at a time and that top layer stays saturated, well, there's really no incentive for those roots to grow deeper into the soil profile. So it does make sense, don't water, twice a week, every week, no matter what. You only want to water during the periods of the time when we're not seeing rainfall. Now, 1 inch of water in our area generally penetrates the soil to a depth of 6 to 8 inches. Now, that is true if the soil is completely dried out. And most instances, though, over 50% of the time, your lawns may only need a half inch of water because there's already some moisture left over from the last rainfall event. So, soil is lost, water is lost from the soil because of evaporation, but also transpiration through stomata, little holes in the leaves. And so if it's really extremely hot outside, if it's really windy, if we've gone an extended period of time that it hasn't rained, then maybe you need to water 3/4 of an inch. Very rarely do you need to water that whole 1 inch. And we'll talk about more of that kind of as we progress. Wherever possible, we want to water slowly for better absorption. So, like around trees and landscape beds, we want to use drip or soaker hose. So, more of the water is actually going into the root zone. With lawn areas, there's different technologies that actually put water out over a longer period of time, and that means we'll lose less water due to runoff. So, more of it's actually going slowly into our root zone. Again, in our planted beds around our turf grass, we want to make sure that we've maintained a 2 to 4 inch layer of mulch around ground covers or different gardens and in shrub areas. And then if you do plant new flowers, which now is a pretty good time as we started to see cooler temperatures. I walked outside this evening and was just like, thank goodness. Like, how long have you spent time outside at 5 o'clock and it wasn't just brutally hot? But if you do plant new things, you don't want to run your entire system to overwater just most of your landscape just to give enough water to those new plants. So hand water anything that's newly planted and continue to run your irrigation system just based on the bulk needs of your landscape. And then always water without creating runoff. If you ever see water going down the sidewalk or the driveway, just go ahead and turn your irrigation controller off. Wait 30, 45 minutes, allow that water to infiltrate, and then actually run it again and let it finish. And there's a way to do that. It's called cycle and soak. But instead of watering for one 15-minute run cycle, you can water it in 3 5-minute cycles. So more of that water again, going into the ground and not running off down the sidewalk rather. We like to say that concrete is growing fast enough in north central Texas. We don't need to water it to help it grow. And check your irrigation system monthly. A lot of people think, oh, this is too much. I'm not going out and going to check my irrigation system monthly. But really, the main thing is you're not going to be running your irrigation system in the winter, so that takes 4 months out of it. Probably you're not going to need it a whole lot in March because we get so much rainfall. November things are starting to cool down, and you may not need it much at all. So really, it's just 6 or 7 months that you would need to check it. If still you think that's too much, do it with a cup of coffee in the morning. Just run your zone, run your irrigation system on test, and go to each zone, and you can watch the birds, watch the sunrise, drink a cup of coffee. What's even more fun is to do it in the evening with your favorite cold beverage, and then you'll even have more fun. That's kind of a joke, but not all the way. Virtual, I can't hear people laugh, so I don't know. The jokes are hit or miss tonight. Another thing to make sure your turf is running great is to know your irrigation controller. So your irrigation controller is going to be in your garage if you have an in-ground system, or on the outside of your house. Open it up, look at the make and the model number, and if you type it in, like Orbit, 3700, or Weathermatic Z28, or whatever it is, type in there and then PDF at the end, and that basically will just bring up your instruction manual. You can print it out. You can leave it somewhere, like where you put your magazines or your newspaper, somewhere where you're bored and you're trying to read something. If you don't know it, it's really very simple. It's like setting your alarm clock. If you can set an alarm clock on your phone is way more complicated than your irrigation controller. They're very easy. If you turn it off, your irrigation controller, and you turn it back on, all the same run times, your same schedules, all that will be the same. So, excuse me. A lot of people do have that concern. Something else you may want to consider is a rain and freeze sensor. Now, these are actually required by law in Texas now. So there was a little bit of a kind of forgiveness time, and now if you make any additions or changes to your irrigation system, you have to install one of these. But the thing is, why would you not want to? So what rain and freeze sensors do, they cost $30 to $50. Are easy for most people to set up as a DIY project, but they'll prevent your irrigation system from going off when it's raining outside, or from going off when we see temperatures below 40 degrees or so. So one thing that I mentioned this in another class we did, but there's actually been precedent set where if your irrigation system goes off and it creates ice on the sidewalk and somebody slips and falls, you can be held liable. If the runoff from there goes off and freezes and a car spins out and gets into a wreck, you could actually be held financially liable for that accident as well. So just something to think about, just from a safety. And the other thing, I don't know, some people may have seen on my social media when it was sleeting right in February, and I was moving some pots inside my garage to keep them warm, and I slipped and fell right off my tailbone, at 300 pounds, and I was holding an agave, pot that probably weighed 150 pounds, and just like I slow mode it, and my wife just kept watching it over and over again. You may think it's funny to slip and fall on the ice, but to do it yourself, man, it's something you'll remember for weeks. Uh, this picture, it just kind of drives home that fact. So this irrigation system is going off when there's flooding conditions in this area. So they're getting so much rainfall that the water is actually built out and the irrigation system is running. That makes almost no sense. We've seen that happen during hurricanes too. Um, but this is really the same thing. So, we see irrigation systems going off when it's raining and people don't think a lot of it. But what if somebody was washing their car in the rain? You would think something is not quite right with that guy. You probably wouldn't want your kids playing with his kids, or If him and his family invited you over for dinner, you'd like, ah, that's that guy that washes his car when it's raining outside. But this is the same thing right here. And not to say, the word crazy, but it is pretty bizarre, and it doesn't make financial sense either, because you're basically just wasting that water. Now, another way that we waste water, we see that happening in lawn areas and can contribute to more problems, is when they're under too much pressure. And that's what is happening in this system. So because there's so much water pressure in the line, it actually creates this fine mist. And that fine mist, the more surface area it has, the more apt it is to blow away. Also, the more likely it is that it's going to evaporate. So in a situation like this, you can see that the water is going up into the sky and it's blowing off of that landscape. So in poorly designed systems like this, up to 60% of the water is lost to evaporation. So 60% of the water you're trying to actually put in the ground so your lawn can use it, it just goes off somewhere else. So you're paying for that water. One thing you can do to help with that is better technology. These are called multi-stream rotors or rotary nozzles. They increase efficiency. They also put out water at slower rates. So the water droplets are bigger, they're heavier, they're more likely through gravity to actually sink and not evaporate. But because they put out that same amount of water over a longer period of time, more of it ends up in our clay soils and those root systems that take a little bit longer to absorb the water. So they're more than 60% efficient. They cost less than $10 a nozzle. So you can actually change them out. Maybe you want to change a whole zone. Now, the thing to keep in mind here, though, is that the regular mist type nozzles we just looked at, those are putting out water, and maybe it's putting out let's say 2/3 of an inch, and it takes 15 minutes to put that out. That's putting out relatively quickly. Well, to put out that same amount of water, these multi-stream rotors may take 30 to 45 minutes. So you're going to have to change your run times on here. So but it's putting out that same amount of water over a longer period of time, which is going to be better for our root zone of our plants to actually get access to that water. And this is actually what they look like running: multi-stream rotors, rotary nozzles. They come in a number of different brands. You can get them in every pattern that you would have normally in your landscape areas. So something just to think about if you're interested in making a change and saving a little money in the long run. We also want to make sure that we're repairing any broken sprinklers. Unrepaired, this could run a leak like this could cost you 10,000 gallons per system per year. In a traditional, just a typical, suburb with 2 to 400,000 people, that could be up to 2 million gallons that is lost just to broken sprinkler heads. So, really is something that we can address to be more sustainable with our water use in the future. Now, sprinkler heads, if you see them spraying water onto the sidewalk or the driveway, if they're missing or not operating, or maybe they're just bubbling and they're not actually putting water out and in a way that actually is making that entire area of your landscape green, there may be a problem. Look for broken or gushing sprinkler heads. If they're not straight up and down, they could be putting more water in one direction than another. So you may want to straighten those up. If they're producing a cloud of mist, it could be that your system is under too much pressure. There are pressure reducers that you can put in your valve box, or actually sprinkler body heads that you can change out that actually have pressure reducers. Or it may just be that there's something clogged in your irrigation head that you need to unclog and clean, and so it's not putting out that mist. The other problem, though, is underwatering. We want to make sure that there's no dry landscape areas either. So look for grass or shrubs or trees blocking the pattern and address those as needed. If your system is under too little water pressure, then it may not be putting water out as far as it should. And so you could be overwatering some areas and underwatering other areas. So make sure that you have what we call head-to-head coverage, where the spray of one sprinkler head is hitting the spray of the other sprinkler head. And typically we're going to put those in either a square or a triangle pattern, and hopefully your system is set up like that. Now, I mentioned some tips on how we would actually know how much we're watering and that we're effectively putting water in our landscape. One way you can do that is through a catch can test. And it's really easy. You can see in this picture, these are kind of funnels that have been set throughout the landscape. But most of the time, I actually use cat food cans or tuna fish cans. It's anything that's about an inch deep. You can set 5 to 9 of those throughout each landscape zone. So just you do one zone at this time. But saying I'm just equally putting 5 to 9 cans through that zone, and then I'm going to run that zone on test. This is going to tell me how long it takes my system to run 1 inch of water. So somebody else's system, that may take 20 minutes. Somebody else's system may take 40 minutes. Mine, it may take 10 minutes. It really depends. So you have to run that test. And maybe you're just doing this once in a season, but this will help make sure your irrigation controller is set at the right time. But also, if you look and could see like, oh, this one's filling up, this can's filling up faster than this can. Why is this one at 3/4 of an inch and this one's only at 1/4 of an inch? There may be a clogged nozzle, or maybe a spray pattern is off. You can kind of, it's pretty much common sense. You look and see, you can kind of play Sherlock Holmes and detective and figure out what's happening there. It may just be cleaning the head. Do you want to run it on test? And so typically I'll just do 5 minutes and see how long it takes, or how much water is filled up in that 5 minutes. So if we run a test for 5 minutes, you can see your tuna fish cans are all roughly about 1/4 inch full. That means you need to run it for 20 minutes to get 1 inch of water. Again, you may only need to water a half an inch or 3/4 of an inch, depending on how much rainfall we've got recently. But that will just tell you how long it would take you to run 1 inch, which is the maximum our lawns would ever need. And then you just do that in each zone. So it's really simple. It's kind of common sense, and you'll make sure that I mean, some people's irrigation systems are watering twice as long as they should be. And that likely means that the majority of the water later in that cycle is actually running down the sidewalk or the driveway. So if you do see that happening, so let's say you run it for 5 minutes or for 7 minutes or what have you, and you'll notice the water just running off. It's not actually going into the soil, it's going down the sidewalk or the driveway. Then you may actually want to stop and let that water absorb in. You wait 30 to 45 minutes and then run it again. And what happens there is that is going to let the water you've already put out slowly sink into the soil further down in the root zone. And then you can water it for another 5 minutes, and that waters the top. You could even do it 3 times if you want. But most irrigation controllers actually have a setting where you can do that, and a cycle and soak setting, or you just are adding other cycles to that. So it would wait, intermittent, wait 30 to 45 minutes and then come back and run that zone again. And that just means that you're not losing the water due to runoff. We call that effective irrigation. It's actually going in the root zone where the plants can use it. So that second cycle is going to infiltrate the soil more efficiently. A third cycle, maybe even a fourth cycle, is beneficial if it's on a slope, or if you have like heavy compacted clays that, maybe you have big dogs or kids and it's just that area the water doesn't want to infiltrate as quickly. Definitely, run 3, 4 cycles to make sure the water's not running off your landscape. So just for an example, you determine after running a catch can test that you need to run your station for 30 minutes. So maybe you want to run it for 2 cycles of 15 minutes each, or 3 cycles for 10 minutes each. But really, it's just dependent on your runoff. So whenever you see it running off, you want to stop it, let it see what that time is. But once you set it up like that, you're not going to have to keep doing this. It's like pretty much you'll fine tune it in there, where your irrigation system, when it waters, that's just how it's going to water, is 3 cycles of 10 minutes rather than 1 cycle of 30 minutes, which for sure would actually be sending runoff down the street. This is just an animation that kind of explains it. If you do see excess irrigation, you're going to run it. That water is going to go out through your landscape. You let it soak in for 30, 45 minutes. Now that water's deeper in the soil profile, then you can run it again, and now those air pockets allow more of the water to infiltrate at the top. And really that's it. It can be as simple as that. Now, one thing you may want to consider also is reducing your turf grass areas. And turf grass has a lot of benefits we've already talked about. But one of the challenges is it tends to be higher maintenance. It requires more water than landscape beds with native and adapted perennials. So if your landscape area is 90% turf grass, there's probably room to reduce that area, to reduce your maintenance, but still have plenty of room to kick a soccer ball or play with your kids, uh, take the dog out to go to the restroom, what have you. We typically also like to balance that with about a third pervious hardscape. And when I talk about this could be dry riverbeds or arroyos that help collect the runoff that's happening from your roof and infiltrate it into the ground where the plants nearby can take advantage. In my backyard, I have, which you can watch tomorrow at 4 o'clock on NBC. You can see my backyard. We did a segment there where we were talking about this very thing. But Samantha Davies and I sat around my fire pit, which I have what they call black decomposed granite. And it actually will allow the water when it rains to infiltrate, and then my turf grass and my plants nearby can take advantage. I also have pathways that when I want to go to this section, my side yard, or maybe to the front yard where I have some fruit trees, all of those pathways, instead of just being concrete, are actually gravel or flagstone or pavers that will allow that water to go in. So, a third turf grass, a third landscape beds, and a third pervious hardscape really are nice for reducing water and maintenance needs, which is beneficial for me in my own landscape. Now, we already talked about all the different turf grasses you can grow, and there may have been one that kind of floated to the surface that you're like, I'm really thinking about zoysia grass now. And what about some of those newer zoysia grasses that are resistant to pest and disease and have a more emerald green look? Well, how would you go about installing that? Well, the first thing you would need is to get your equipment together. You're going to need a rake, a heavy metal rake that has a backside that you can use for leveling. Many of these are a little bit wider in order to get that level area. You also may need some cutting tools. In fact, a machete is a tool that I use pretty frequently. I did some projects in Kenya and lived in Kenya for a short time, and everyone walking down the street in this area of kind of just south of the South Sudan border, everybody had, they called them pangas and machetes. You think this is kind of strange that everybody has all these huge knives walking around, but really it's a tool that I came to use very frequently, just effective in the landscape. One thing you can use is it to cover to cut or sod, maybe an old landscape knife or even an old knife from your toolbox. You also are going to need a sod roller. So sod rollers are filled with water, and when you're laying out sod, what they do is help to get good root system to soil contact. That's one of the key things. You don't want air bubbles underneath your sod, or that's going to cause the root system to dry out. If it's flush, then that's actually, it encourages a deeper root system to establish more quickly, but there's more moisture there if there's not an air pocket. Now, most places you buy sod from actually do have sod rollers available for rent. Some of them will actually let you borrow them for free, which is great. So once you've got your equipment, what is the checklist? Well, the first thing you want to do is eradicate current vegetation. If that's Bermuda grass, you're probably going to want to rent a sod cutter, and you're going to cut that Bermuda grass out. You may actually want to hire some people that will have a small little bobcat skid steer and remove some of that vegetation. Uh, you can also do it if you're trying to do things organically. You could do like, clear plastic and laying it down. That's going to take a little bit longer time and then digging it up, but you want to eradicate the vegetation. Maybe you even want to spray it with some herbicides if you have like some aggressive weeds that are growing in there. So if I had Bermuda grass lawn and I was going to go in with buffalo grass, I would probably use some type of herbicide. Now, I've been organic in my landscape for 15 years. Last year, one time I was trying to control some nut sedge and I'd used organic methods and it wasn't being effective. But for the most part, those are the things that I'm going to look at is ways that I can effectively control weeds without using chemicals or reducing my chemical use or synthetic chemicals. And eradicating buffalo grass is extreme, or eradicating Bermuda grass is extremely challenging. Eradicating Bermuda grass in buffalo grass, if your buffalo grass has Bermuda in it, there is no herbicide that you can spray on your Bermuda grass that's not going to kill your buffalo grass. So you want to make sure that you've removed it before you actually put it down. So set yourself up for success. Then you're going to want to either rake in or till in some type of compost. You may also bring in some sandy loam. Many times people bring in a little bit better soil and we'll incorporate that into our heavy clay soils just to create a better root zone so the turf grass can grow and thrive. So we call that a base soil. You can either mix in compost into our existing soil or you want to bring in that base soil, but you do want to incorporate that. Then that's where the rake comes in. So you want to level it and make sure it is as level as possible. One reason you want to make sure it's level is so you do have good root to soil contact. The other reason you want to make sure it's level is it's harder to level after the turf grass is already established. So you don't want to be running and your kids twisting their ankles or anything like that. So you actually want it to be as level as possible. Then when you're putting down your sod, you want to lay it in a brick-like pattern and you want it to be as close together as possible. So if there is any kind of seam, that's a space where weed can grow and it can go to seed and to spread. So if you get them as close together in a brick-like pattern, there's going to be less likely that weeds can outcompete. Now, there's a couple different ways that you can do that. Most of your sod suppliers are going to have some options to either buy them in rolls or buy them in the smaller bricks. The smaller bricks are lighter and they're easier for people to carry. The larger rolls are going to produce less seams. It just really depends on your personal preference and maybe if you're doing it, if you've actually hired someone to do it. But it is remarkable that if you're installing turf grass, how in just a couple hours you can go from having just dirt to nothing to actually having what looks like a lawn. Now, you're going to have to water this a little bit more frequently. You're going to have to make sure that if the top inch of the soil dries out, that you're going to return that water, especially if we're seeing warmer temperatures. But after a few weeks, you can taper off that irrigation. Once the root zone is established, then it'll be like any other lawn where you only actually need to water during those rainfall between those rainfall events. So let's say you've installed new turf grass and it's established, or you have your good old lawn. Well, how are you actually mowing to maintain it? There's different types of mowers out there. Most people use a rotary mower. Of course, with any of these, it's key that you actually keep a sharp mower blade. In fact, most people do recommend sharpening them, having a sharp one at the beginning of the season, and then midway through the season, June or July, actually sharpening it again. You may actually have two mower blades and keep one sharp, and then you're just flipping them off. They're very easy to change. Just having a metal file that has coarse on one side and finer on the other side, very, very easy to sharpen. You could use a grinder, or you could actually take it to your local lawn care company and have them sharpen it as well. Electric mowers are also becoming very, very popular. It's funny. One of my neighbors actually has. It's like an iRobot, but it's a mower that it just automatically mows their lawn. It's fascinating. Every time I'm walking by, I'm just like, I can't believe this is the time we're living in, where people have robots that vacuum that mow their landscape. Anyway, I use an electric mower as well, just a battery powered one, and they work very well. The benefits is you can actually go in the morning or later at night and mow and not worry about bothering your neighbors. You're not worrying about spilling gas or spilling oil. If you're getting your energy from solar or from wind, if your electric company, that's where they're getting their electricity from, then you're kind of carbon neutral there. You're getting very close to it. And the batteries are fairly effective where you can mow the entire landscape. Some of them you can actually buy two batteries or larger batteries for, but I've been pleasantly surprised with the new electric mowers. In fact, most of the big name companies now make an electric version as well. I also have one of these. I have a Fiskars reel mower that I push. I will say I probably have not used this in the past year, if I'm completely honest. When I have a 2-year-old daughter, and so it doesn't. It's there's a lot of stuff on the to-do list, but when I lived in Oak Cliff and it was just my wife and I would use this mower fairly frequently, and I enjoyed it. It's completely quiet. It actually cuts the lawn even better. Works better for the finer bladed grasses, and you have to keep it sharp. It doesn't cut through weeds very good. If you don't want to hit it with a stick, I can't tell you how many times. And most of y'all listening have used this before at some point, especially if you're older and this was the only mower you had. But if you're at a full pace and you hit a stick with one of these, you're getting the handlebars in your gut, and it'll take the wind out of you. But there are also gas-powered real mowers if you're trying to get very low. But for the most part, we wouldn't recommend keeping a lawn that low to need a gas powered reel mower. You should probably mow weekly. One of the reasons that we want to mow weekly is because it is one of the mechanical controls or the cultural controls that will keep weeds down. We don't want weeds to grow and set their seeds. So if we mow frequently, the weeds never get a chance to proliferate. So it makes sense. You're breaking apical dominance. Your turf grass is going to be thicker, more lush, and you're not dealing with the weed seed. So some people may say, "Oh, I only water every couple weeks because I never irrigate my lawn." Probably better to discourage weeds from coming in to actually mow every 7 days at least. We want to make sure also that we're only cutting a third of the leaf blade at the time. So if we let it go for 2 weeks and we come and we mow, we're cutting half of the leaf blade. That stresses out the plant. So we want to just give it a little bit of a haircut. We never want to just come and chop it off, especially during the summer months. You may want to actually raise the mower up a little bit, or if for some reason you went out of town, that next mowing, raise it up so you're only cutting a third of the leaf blade, and then wait the next week and just cut it a little bit lower. Maybe you're waiting every 5 days just to get it back down to the height that you want it. We also don't recommend bagging your grass clippings. In fact, in some cities, this is against the city ordinance to be sending grass clippings and other natural materials to the landfill. If it goes to the landfill, it's actually not broken down like it should. If we're composting it on our property or we're sending it to the city where they can actually compost it, then those are nutrients that can be returned to the soil. If it's mixed with diapers and trash and other stuff in a landfill, it contributes to greenhouse gases. They have to off gas methane, and it's just not a good situation. So 90% of the time, what we're doing is actually we're putting a mulching blade on the lawnmower, taking the bag off of it, mowing, keeping it sharp, so it's actually cutting those grass clippings fine, and different beneficial bacteria, microbes, fungi are breaking down those grass clippings. They're adding organic matter to the soil, like kind of letting them compost in place. And 9 times out of 10, that is perfectly fine to do here in North Central Texas. With some of the fighter bladed grasses, you may actually have to periodically like rake some of it out, or to if that starts to build up in there, just the leaves that haven't completely broken down, put them into your compost pile. But definitely, we don't want to send it to the landfill. But I mentioned raising the mower height, and it's something that you may want to do, especially during the summer months. The other thing during the growing season you may want to do is change up your mowing pattern. So if you're mowing in one direction one week, mow in the other direction the other week. I always like doing this circle pattern, but I always felt like when I started off in the middle, you're just twirling around the center of your landscape. What are the neighbors thinking? This big crazy bald guy with his real mower just turning around in circles. But this reduces compaction. It also tends to, if all your blades are clean and your shoes are clean, it can deter pest or disease problems from spreading throughout the landscape as well. Now, periodically, you'll hear people talk about scalping and overseeding. In our area, it's not a recommended practice. In fact, I don't know really any horticulturists that I know and hang out with in my circles that recommend the practice. One of the reasons we wouldn't want to do that um, is because let's say this is a Bermuda grass lawn. If you were going through and you're scalping this in like November, then you would be planting, or maybe it's October, but you would be planting some type of cool season grass seed there, so your lawn looks green through the winter. Well, if you're cutting it extremely low, you're probably likely hurting the crowns of the top of the root zone. That's actually where the new growth is coming from. We don't want to do that. We actually, it's also a time when we don't want to put our turf grass to undue stress. What we'd like to see is that time where the blades are sending nutrients down to the soil, and that's going to help them recover in the spring a little bit better. The other problem is if we're overseeding with, rye or fescue or something like that, then those grasses are going to grow only when it's cold outside. They will not grow in 90-degree weather in Texas. But when the Bermuda grass starts to wake up in the spring, it's going to have a slower recovery time because that cool season turf grass is out competing it. So it's bad for a lot of reasons. What we're kind of just used to is letting our turf grass go blonde for the winter, and then it recovers in the spring and is perfectly fine. Now is a time to fertilize your lawn if you haven't already. I just fertilized last week using a rotary spreader. There's also other spreaders called a drop spreader. Now, many of the rotary spreaders actually have an edge guard now. And so what that does is just prevent the granular fertilizer from spraying onto the sidewalk. We don't want to see as any of the nutrients we're putting out run off the sidewalk down to the creek, because they contribute to problems with excess nutrients. Drop spreaders tend to be more precise, but if you're applying them, you want to make sure that you're getting good coverage. With both of these, you want to make sure you're getting good coverage. Drop spreaders are just a little bit more precise. When you are applying fertilizer, always look at the label. What we'd like to see in our area is mostly slow release nitrogen. So a lot of times you'll see a bag of fertilizer that's being sold with 19, 19, 19, or those numbers on the bag. And that is not good. In fact, you're paying more money for something that you shouldn't be applying to your landscape. So if you are applying a fertilizer, most of the time, just a slow release nitrogen, one that's higher in the first number, is going to be all that you need. Now, you can get a soil test, and a soil test will make recommendations of exactly how many pounds per square foot you need to apply. And that's always something, if you haven't ever tested your soil, then what you would do is remove a flap of your lawn, just kind of cut it on three sides, fold it back, and try and get just a little bit of soil from there and not any roots or grass or anything like that. And then you can fold that flat back and do that in a few spots, mix it together in one bucket, and then you can send your soil sample to a local lab, or there are some colleges that have labs that you can take them to. You can even test it yourself many times. There's that at-home soil testing kits. But then they'll send you back recommendations on what nutrients you actually need to add. Most of the time, we do not need to add a lot of phosphorus or potassium, and the nitrogen that we're applying should be slow release so it doesn't have the chance of running off down our creeks. It's just, that's what any guru will tell you that deals with turf grass here in our area. Now, no weed and feed. Now, the reason we don't recommend weed and feed products, and the other day when I was buying my fertilizer, I saw there's a lot of areas that have just 90% of the products for turf grass are not products that would be recommended for our area. Typically, when you're putting out a fertilizer, it is not the same time that you would be putting out an herbicide. Those would things to kill weeds and things to kill to actually provide nutrients to your turf grass are best applied at different times and in different bags. So it doesn't mean you shouldn't be putting out a pre-emerging or you shouldn't be fertilizing. Yes, both those things are great and there are organic options for each. But if you put them in a bag, you're going to be over applying one. You could be under applying another. You could be putting one out too late and one out too early. And now there's even 3-in-1s and 4-in-1s where they have fire ant bait. Now is not the time to be putting out fire ant bait. And you wouldn't want to put fire ant bait out on your entire landscape if you only had one fire ant mound over here. So no weed and feed, no 3-in-1 products. I mentioned fertilization and the numbers on the bag. The number is the ratio between nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So you'll notice this bag has a 3-1-2 ratio. So if we look at the lowest number is 5, well, 5 goes into 15 3 times. 2 times is going to be 10. So the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium in this bag is at a 3-1-2 ratio. Now, this isn't a bad ratio, but I probably wouldn't be putting that out twice a year no matter what, because our heavy clay soils tend to hold phosphorus. They have plenty of phosphorus already, but if you apply phosphorus and potassium, it tends to stay in heavy clays longer. So the reason we only want to recommend nitrogen-based products or products that have majority nitrogen, maybe they have a little bit of iron in there, is so we're not over applying to nutrients that our landscape would need. If we over apply phosphorus and potassium, if you bought that 19-19-19 bag, that could actually affect the nitrogen uptake, and a lot of that phosphorus and potassium, if it's not used, is going to end out running down the creeks, and that's not something we want to do either. So if you are applying a nitrogen fertilizer this time of year, it's not too late. You can go by, look and see, just has nitrogen, the first label, or maybe it's the main number. Maybe it has a little bit of potassium in there too. But apply half the rate that it says on the bag and then go in one direction and then go in the other direction and apply that same amount. So that is how we get a better uniformity. What we don't want to see is lawns that look like this, where you're, unless you want to be funny, you can write your initials in it, but we don't want to be misapplying, because then we have just really green areas and really yellow areas or lighter green areas, and it kind of looks silly like that. We want to get better distribution. So typically we only recommend 2 times a year to fertilize, and you may not even have to do that if you're getting a soil test. But generally, for zoysia grasses, you're going to wait until it greens up in the spring. If you're putting out a fertilizer and your lawn is not green, that fertilizer will not be absorbed to the plants. It's going to end up running off your landscape. So zoysia grasses and buffalo grasses may green up a little bit later than Bermuda and St. Augustine. It really kind of depends on the species, but a general rule of thumb is to only apply after the third mowing. So typically the first time you're mowing, it's just going to be the lawn is just starting to green up. The second mowing, a week later, maybe there's a little bit more green. Maybe by the third mowing, your lawn is 3/4 green. That's the perfect time to fertilize. The reason I say don't use weed and feed products is that is not a good time to apply a pre-emergent, which is the main ingredient in a weed and feed. So if you're actually wanting to control weeds, you would need to put out the pre-emergent a month before that. And we'll talk about that as we kind of progress, but that is the reasoning behind that. So you can kind of look through here. Bermuda grass, you may actually want to put another application in June if you want it to be green through the summer. But here's the thing. If your Bermuda grass is like light green, it's not a dark emerald green in the summer, it's also going to use less water. So, I would probably skip that June fertilization, or maybe just fertilize with an organic fertilizer or something that's very light. There's one product called Milorganite, something very light that doesn't have a lot, but fertilizing very heavy in the summer is going to make the plant grow and then in turn use more water, which doesn't really make sense. Excessive nutrients, I mentioned some of the challenges, but excessive phosphorus can reduce the amount of nitrogen, or not, can reduce nitrogen as well, but also iron. So we have iron problems in our soil. The heavy clays want to hold on to the iron. So just kind of keep that in mind. We don't want to apply too much. If we apply too much nitrogen, we'll see more pest and disease problems, as well as both of those could contribute to poor water quality if it runs out your landscape. But if that's confusing, you're not exactly sure how much, get a soil test and it will make recommendations on exactly how much of each nutrient you need to add rather. So I mentioned the traffic tolerance, just kind of following up with that. Generally, our zoysian, our Bermuda grasses are going to be more tolerant. Our St. Augustine is probably the least tolerant. Buffalo grass, probably not as tolerant to traffic as well. So if you are seeing compaction in those soils, especially, Bermuda grass perhaps, or St. Augustine, you may want to aerate your turf grass. Some people do it in the fall. Many people do it in the spring. Basically, this is a piece of equipment that you can either push behind if you rent it. You can actually hire people. Many of your lawn mowing companies will do that as well. You may see people in your neighborhood doing it, but it just takes a little core out. That core is going to reduce runoff. It's going to allow more of the water to infiltrate. Some of the organic matter of the leaves and the roots from the grass nearby will end up in there. So it's kind of like little bitty compost piles that help add nutrients. It can also help with insect infestations that hang out in the thatch, the layer of leaves that haven't fully broken down. So think about that. And also, the cores are kind of just like they'll compost in place. And so it's kind of like as they break down, they're adding organic matter to that top layer. This is kind of what it looks like. You've probably seen this on a lot of sports fields. You probably don't have to do this every year, but if you had a really compacted area, maybe it was on a slope, you're having issues with water infiltrating, you may want to give this a shot and see if that helps. Sometimes people will actually core aerate and then they'll come back through with compost and have compost spread if they had really clay soils. Now I want to transition talking about some of the most common pests that we see. This is one that we see primarily in St. Augustine. If they're about the size of a sesame seed, you'll notice them in full sun spots. So if you have a full sun spot in St. Augustine and it's got these irregular dead patterns, one thing you can do is put a little bit of soapy water in a pump sprayer, maybe even just a bucket, and kind of spread it around that area. And then take a white piece of paper, and I have one right here, but in my printer. But take a white piece of paper and just run it over the leaf blades of the grass, and you'll that what that soapy water does is kind of makes these come up to the surface from the base. And if you're running this off the top of the leaves, you'll start to see little flecks about the size of sesame seeds. They're black when they're mature. When they're young, they may have like an orange and yellow stripe. But they're fairly easy to control. There's organic and synthetic products that will work. But they can cause, mostly it's this aesthetic damage to turf grass. But and, if it was a weekend in St. Augustine, it may actually kill that section of the lawn. Grubworms are something else to think about. Now, primarily, we're going to see these just kind of right after you see the heavy June bug infestation. So the Japanese beetles, little brown beetles you'll see on your porch, those are their adult stage, and they come there and they mate, and then after that they'll go lay their eggs, and then their eggs will turn into these little grub worms, and in the late summer they'll actually eat some spots of your turf grass. Now, if there's just a few, if you're digging, especially if it's a really big grub, that's a rhinoceros beetle. That's not a problem. But if you see a lot of these smaller ones in the same spot, you may consider treating them. There's organic products like beneficial nematodes that will help control them. There's also several synthetic products they can use. What you want to make sure, though, is you're applying those at the right time and only if you have grub infestations. Now, people used to recommend putting them out every year, no matter what. Insecticides throughout your entire landscape to kill grubs. Even the people that used to recommend that don't recommend that anymore because you're killing other insects that have collateral damage. And if the insect is not there, let's say you found a couple of grub worms, but you're putting it on the entire landscape, if that can't be taken up by them, then what else is that chemical affecting? Is it affecting, other beneficial insects in your soil? Is it running off your landscape, causing problems? So just apply it if you need it. Now, you may have seen here earlier in the season, especially if we get a lot of rainfall, you'll see fall armyworms that will come through and they'll really eat most of the lawns. Primarily, they like St. Augustine and Bermuda grass. They'll eat a number of other plants, but they mostly just eat the top growth. So, unless you have them in large numbers, you probably don't need to treat them at all. They're organic products that have spinosad or spinosad in there, as well as BT can be effective as well if you have some of that on hand. But these are, some people will call them Miller moths, but you'll notice kind of here in a few weeks, you may see a lot of moths as we start to get cooler temperatures. Those are the adult versions of these. And really, it's for the most part in the lawn, they're not going to do a whole lot of damage. Um, Try using some organic products if they're in high numbers. They can also eat some of the vegetables or fall vegetables that we've already got started, and so just kind of keep that in mind. There's also different scale pest in lawn areas. This is scale that we're seeing in a Bermuda grass lawn. It may be a symptom of over fertilizing and over watering. These are harder to control. Many times with these, you actually have to use something that is systemic, that is actually going to be taken up to the plant because they have a hard waxy coating. But with any of these, you don't have to write it down or anything. Just be able to identify, oh, this looks like chinch bug damage, this looks like grub worm damage, and then you can either type in grubworm St. Augustine edu, and there will be papers from universities that talk about all the methods to control those. You could also just go to your local nursery and say, hey, I'm fighting grubworms in St. Augustine grass, and they'll be able to help you. If you say you're fighting chinch bugs in St. Augustine grass, they'll be able to help you. But just know what your pest is, identify it, even take it to the local nursery people and they can identify it. But some products you may be able to use on St. Augustine, but you may not want to use on zoysia grass. And so just kind of keep that in mind, or buffalo grass. There are also some diseases where that could be a problem. Most common diseases we're going to see on turf grass are fungal diseases. One of those we'll see is large patch, now more correctly called called large patch. We used to call it brown patch, but you'll see it basically makes kind of yellow or brown rings inside the turf grass. There are some fungicides that'll work with this. Again, many times it's a sign of overwatering and over fertilizing. Perfect conditions for fungal problems to occur when we're watering too frequently and we've put a lot of nitrogen fertilizer on there where the turf grass is just more susceptible to damage from fungus. There's also take all patch. You may see this again, lower light areas, areas that tend to stay wet. Once you'll start digging the roots, or digging in the plant, you'll like pick up a grass and the roots will look like they're just completely rotted. Again, if you think, oh, I think I have take all patch and I have, St. Augustine lawns or Bermuda grass lawn, then there'll be recommendations on what you can apply. There's several different products. They have several different trade names, and so we don't really have time to get into the depth. But one thing that every person listening can do, you may not remember the exact herbicide or the exact fungicide, but if you can identify the problem and you know what type of lawn you have, then you can choose what product is right for you, whether it's organic control or synthetic control. A leaf spot, gray leaf spot, we see this with St. Augustine every year during wet periods. This is one that there are fungicides that you can apply, but for the most part, it's not recommended. What you would do is taper off watering. Most of the time, the St. Augustine is going to recover once we stop getting excessive rain. The other problem is if you're putting out fungicides, fungicides generally have more of an environmental impact than even some of our herbicides or our insecticides. So I would use those with caution. Um, the main thing is to reduce the conditions that are right for fungal problems. That's growing shade and growing turf grass in too shady of an area, setting and forgetting your irrigation system so your leaf blades are staying wet. Um, if you can reduce that, you're going to see a great reduction in your fungal problems. Let's transition talking about weeds. Now, a weed is just any plant growing out of place. Some some person's weed may be another person's wildflower. But if you are trying to control weeds in your landscape, the first thing you want to know is what their life cycle is. So again, all this information is in the handout that you can download, comprehensive lawn care in the PDF. But annuals grow and produce seeds and die in 1 year. Now, generally, they're going to be the easiest to kill because they don't have really an extensive root zone and they're going to die anyway. So, like dandelions, once they put out their seeds, that's the end of their life cycle. So, if you can prevent them from going to seed, then that's it. That dandelion's going to die on its own with your help or not. Biennials typically live for 2 years. The first year they're going to grow. Typically, it's a basal rosette. It's just basically leaves at the bottom. The second year they send up a spike, and that's seeds. Again, you want to make sure that you're getting them, whether you're physically removing them or you're spraying them with something before they set seed. That's the name of the game of reducing weeds. You have some weeds in your landscape, but if you can prevent them from flowering and going to seed, then they're not going to spread to other areas of your landscape. And if you can continue to do that through cultural, mechanical, chemical, control, then those seeds that are in your seed bank are going to get used up, and then your turf grass is going to be able to overcrowd any that would come back in. Now, perennial weeds are generally the hardest to kill. Perennial just means that they live 3 years or more, but they can also produce seeds each year. So some perennial weeds, if they just keep growing and keep spitting out seeds, then you have more weeds and more weeds and more weeds to contend with, which creates a challenge. So the other way that we need to kind of categorize weeds so we can control them is if they are broadleaf, grassy, or grass-like. So if we're using a selective herbicide, one that will target the weed and not kill the lawn, they are very specific at controlling weeds by their different morphology or kind of the shapes of their leaves. And I'll go through some right now. But broadleaf weeds, one example is, yeah, this is dandelion. So it has a thicker leaf. That's what it means, broadleaf. This is a grassy weed. This is annual bluegrass or Poa annua. And it is a very common winter weed in North Texas lawns. Then there are also grass-like weeds that are they don't fit into either one of those groups. Common broadleaf weeds are clover. A lot of people like clover for its ability to fix nitrogen, its ability to provide pollinators with a nectar source when it's cold outside, but clover is a weed in some lawns. Dollarweed, also, we see this primarily in areas where there's excess moisture. Turn off your irrigation system when it's rained or fix the leak. You'll see less of this. Also, tons of people around the world eat dollarweed. In fact, I can pretty much guarantee you can go to a restaurant where you would pay $100 a plate. I mean, in fact, I know chefs that I've gone foraging with who will take dollarweed and serve it to you on a $100 a plate dish. It's delicious. You can eat it. Dichondra is another weed we see, again, often in areas that stay too moist. People have dichondra lawns where they don't actually have grass. And then dandelions. But all these are example of broadleaf weeds. Spurge is another one. This is very common this time of year. It has the milky sap. But these group of herbicides can kill these broadleaf weeds without killing your lawn. Henbit is another one. This is an annual. I believe this one is actually native, but it produces these purple blooms, and then those blooms will spread seeds all throughout your landscape, and every winter you'll be fighting a henbit. Grassy weeds. Dallas grass is one that's a challenge. It kind of has big seed heads that looks like a roll of dimes. Like if you got a roll of dimes from the bank and you just kind of roll them off, that's what it looks like. Crabgrass, very common grass-like weed in our area. Goosegrass is similar, but it's more flat and has a white center. Again, there's the annual bluegrass, otherwise known as Poa annua. Anybody recognize this grassy weed? This is the bane of my existence. This is a weed that I deal with most in the vegetable garden, and this is just common Bermuda grass. It gets in, it finds a way. Spreads by stolons and rhizomes, and it was bred to be so effective, but it just gets into vegetable gardens. I don't know how it does, but it just wants to spread and can be a problem. Then now I mentioned the grass-like weeds. Many of these are nut sedges or nut grass, yellow nut sedge, purple nut sedge. These are spread by their nutlets, so they have little nodules in the ground. Once they get fairly big, they may have 3 to 5 of those, and when you go and pull it up, those break off. You'll only get the top part of the root, and then where you had one, you'll have 3 or 5. And if you keep doing that, now if you pull them when they're very young, you can get the whole part of it and use, a little weeder tool to kind of make sure you're getting the nutlets. But it can be problematic. I mentioned I was organic for 15 years. I use a product called Sedge Hammer. There's several other products that will work that will kill these and not the grass. But once you have a nutgrass infestation or nut sedge infestation, it is extremely hard to control through organic means. Um, and so that's why I gave up, and I feel really bad about it. Now I'm telling the public, but it's what it is. So now let's talk about more about like herbicides. So how are we actually going to kill those weeds? There are non-selective and there are selective herbicides. So non-selective means when you spray something with it, it's going to kill or damage the plant no matter what. So if you spray Roundup or you spray vinegar on a weed in your lawn, both of those are going to kill the weed and the surrounding grass. I mentioned sedge hammer. There are selective herbicides like that one that will kill the nut sedge, but they won't kill the grass nearby. We also put herbicides into categories pre-emergent and post-emergent. Pre-emergents are they're both liquid and granular. They're going to target the weed seeds before they germinate. It's basically going to create a little force field in the top layer of your soil, and any weeds there are either going to just pop up and fizzle out, or they're just not going to grow at all. Post-emergent herbicides, we put in the non-selective to selective herbicide, but those are going to target the weed after it's already showing its leaves and it popped up. So pre-emergent controls them before they emerge. Post-emergent controls them after they emerge. And there's several different products here, organic, synthetic. This weed zap uses acetic acid or vinegar. It's organic. They're like Prevention Plus here that is a pre-emergent. There's also lawn and weed crabgrass killer. So this has at least two different herbicides in the same bottle. I would steer people away from this. So let's say this one where it says Bear Advance all in one. It will kill your crabgrass and it will kill your dandelions. But if you have dandelions in one area and you have crabgrass in the other area, then it really doesn't make sense to use this product. Where it would make the most sense is if you had crabgrass and dandelions together. The reason that is, you don't want to be applying something if you don't have that pest. When we say pesticides, one pest of a pesticide is going to be weeds. And if you don't have that weed, it doesn't make sense to put that chemical on there. Now, I know it can be confusing with some folks, and so I want to dig a little bit deeper into that. Well, let's break down the pre-emergent versus post-emergent herbicides again. Again, pre-emergents are applied anytime before the weed seedlings emerge through the soil surface. One example of some chemistry that does that is a product called pendimethalin. Now, these have to be watered into the soil within the appointed time. Some of them are actually liquid based, but the granular ones, you need to put at least a half an inch of water down so it can kind of absorb and make that little force field. You have to avoid putting these in planting areas. I was considering putting a pre-emergent part of my landscape, but there's a landscape nearby where I'm actually going to be trying to put down a little bit of seed, and so I didn't want to put a pre-emergent down because I don't want to deter any plants I'm trying to plant by seed from popping up. Now, these are not effective once the weeds are showing. So if you were putting a fertilizer out in April or May, and that was a weed and feed, that all the weed part of that weed and feed is not going to be effective. In fact, some of them can actually damage certain turf grasses if you're applying them too late. Post-emergence are applied after the weed seedlings have emerged. 2,4-D and binoxidil are two of those. Now, I mentioned this before, but generally you want to apply pre-emergence the middle of September to like late August. So August 15th to September 15th is really what we're looking at there. So it is probably too late to get effective control of our winter weeds by putting a pre-emergent out now. You would want to have put it out, 2 to 4 weeks ago in order for that to be effective. There's several different pre-emergents on the market. The only one that would potentially work, and that is just potentially, that is organic, is corn gluten meal. I actually am putting out some corn gluten meal. I should have put it out a couple weeks ago and I didn't, but it's organic, and I know that it may not be effective as a pre-emergent because I've applied it at the wrong time, but it does have nitrogen in it, and I do need a little bit of nitrogen in my backyard. So that is the source that I'm going to use there. Typically, it's when soil temperatures are between 50 to 55 degrees if we're applying these in the spring. And so if we're applying them in September, the goal is to prevent the winter weeds from popping up. If we're applying them in February, we're trying to prevent the spring and summer weeds from coming up. So that can change when the soil temperature is warm exactly, but generally mid-September for your winter weeds and mid-February for your spring and summer weeds. But you have to apply them before the weeds pop up. I know it's confusing, and I hope I'm explaining this good enough. Post-emergent, so there are a number of them. We talked about them before. Sedge hammer is one that controls nut sedge but won't kill your grass. Some of them, there are selective herbicides that can control just broadleaf weeds or just grass leaf weeds. There's also organic versions like this Burnout, which actually uses, I believe this one has orange oil in there. There's some that have clove oil and cinnamon oil in there that are fairly effective at controlling and getting good kill. A lot of organic herbicides just kill the top part of the weed, and then it will grow back, and you may have to spray it again. But that could be true with glyphosate or Roundup products as well. There are better ways to control weeds organically than with organic herbicides. However, there may be some spots where I don't want to pull all these little weeds in a patio, and I've weed eated them down, and I'm going to spray them with an organic, vinegar-based product. I think that's completely fine, but it doesn't really make sense to be spraying them in a lawn area. So now let's talk about non-selective versus selective herbicides. So non-selective, another term is broad spectrum. These are going to kill anything that you spray them on. So paraquat, glyphosate, Roundup is one of those. Selective are going to control specific weeds or weed categories, but they're not going to kill the lawn. We mentioned this, that's just a little bit of a review. So they'll kill the weed and not the lawn. There are no organic products that are selective herbicides. So kind of keep that in mind. And I'm running out of time, so I'm going to go quickly through this, but because I want to have time for questions. But to put it all together, what we'd like to see is integrated weed management. So we want to take steps to actually prevent the weeds from coming in there. So we could have a turf grass that is lush and healthy, that is dense, where if a weed seed blows in, it actually can't take root. So we're mowing once a week, where we're not just, some people say, I haven't watered, it's been 3 months and I haven't watered. Well, you probably should have watered a little bit in the summer, just when that's recommended, so that that turf stays lush, so it can outcompete the weeds that come in. What we don't want to see is for that turf to go away and there be bare spots and that erosion that is going in, down the storm drain. That's equally problematic. The most effective control of weeds is mechanical control. Y'all don't want to hear it, but it's actually pulling the weeds, physical removal, using weed tools after rainfall event, and just pulling, 15 weeds this day. The next time it rains, pull 15 weeds. Get your husband or wife out there, pull 15. Have a contest, who can pull the most weed. Do it happy hour, free beer if you pull the most weed, something like that. But it is the most effective for biennial and perennial weeds for sure. Cultural control, again, just supporting healthy, dense turf grass that is going to outcompete those weeds. Proper mowing is also key, proper fertilization, proper irrigation. And if you do that, you're probably going to have less weeds that are a problem. Now, I know some people tuning in tonight are probably in a homeowners association or HOA. So if you're not familiar with Senate Bill 198, this may be helpful to you. Senate Bill 198 protects a homeowner's right to compost on their property, to install rain barrels or other rainwater harvesting systems, to implement efficient irrigation systems like those multi-stream rotors we talked about, rotary nozzles, to incorporate drought-resistant landscape or water-conserving natural turf. So if you wanted to transition to buffalo grass or zoysia grasses, and your HOA is saying, no, you have to have St. Augustine, by law, they cannot tell you that. They can ask that you submit a design, and they have to prove that design within reason. They cannot tell you that you have to have turf grass in this one area, like your parkway. They can ask that you have a certain amount of your landscape in turf grass, so keep that in mind as well. But if you have any problems with HOA, you're trying to incorporate some of these practices, Senate Bill 198 may be helpful for you. Another resource that is helpful for you is waterisawesome.com. And one thing that I kind of buried the lead was that you can actually go to waterisawesome.com and you can sign up for weekly watering advice. And that was the wrong video. This is the right video. I've already told y'all can download the lawn care guides there. But if you go to the watering advice and you click on it, it will send you an email. You can sign up, or a text message. You pick which one. They don't send you spam or anything like this. It's all our local water providers that have kind of banded together, but using local weather station data based on just keeping your lawns healthy. They will make recommendations on how long, how much you need to water based on the irrigation technology that you have. And last year, and I'm a horticulturist. I want to have a lawn that's nice, just like everybody else. At my home in Richardson, I only had to water 13, 14 times. I watered less than that, but that was their recommendation. And 3/4 of the time, that was a half an inch or water or less. I know there are people out there listening and watching that are watering a wind an inch a week, and they're watering 30 times a year, and that is likely way too much water. In fact, it is likely going to be less healthy for your turf grass to water that much. So sign up for weekly watering advice at waterisawesome.com. You can also check out some of the resources at rootedin.com. I would love to connect on social media too. And now, if we have a little bit of time left, I would love to answer any questions that you have. And I'll go ahead and turn that over to Heather with Tarrant Regional Water District, and Water is Awesome, who is on the line. And you can ask your question, and she'll see it in the little chat, and she can relay it to us. But if you have any questions, go ahead and type those in now, whether it has to do with lawn or irrigation or really anything we've talked about. We'd love to tackle those with the time we have left.
Okay, so we do have some questions already. Our first question is about the smart sprinkler systems or smart irrigation controllers. Are they worth it? What type of controller do you recommend?
Yeah, I think a lot of the smart controllers are worth it. It really depends on the person. So there's technologies that you can buy to update your existing controller that you could just control it from your phone if you wanted to. And I think that appeals to me if I'm out of town, if my wife is having an issue with the irrigation controller. It's something. If I forget to turn it off and we haven't, it's raining and the rain and freeze sensor isn't working, I can control it from anywhere. I think that's great. There's also a number of brands. Ratio's the most popular. There's also a lot of other ones that people like. I'm just blanking on the names that will actually use local weather station data to water. You have to actually go set each zone to what, because it doesn't know what plants are in the zone. So if you have a landscape area that's just like agave and cacti and yucca, and you have an area that's trees, and you have an area of vegetables, and you have an area that's just like mixed planting of native and adapted plants, you have to go tailor that in. And there's a learning curve. In fact, we've done classes where we walk people through the process. There's even people that are engineers that are like, this thing is complicated, and going through and figuring it out. So for the average homeowner, you're probably not going to use all the features of like a ratio, but for certain people that are very tech savvy, there's a lot of appeal to them. So, I have a smart home. I have smart locks on all my doors. I have Alexa everywhere that controls my lights and does everything. That type of stuff I nerd out on. If you're interested in that, I think probably a smart controller for just $50 more, maybe something you'd have fun with. If you're not into the latest greatest cell phone or any of the at-home speakers, then you may just want to use the simple controllers or the ones that are just a regular controller that isn't using ET data, and then just using waterisawesome.com. Hey, they sent me a text message and say I need to water a quarter inch. I set my system to water a quarter inch, and then I'm done, and I don't have to worry about if my sprinkler system's going off because it has a mind of its own. But that's my take. I think there's probably a lot of different views on that.
Okay. Our next question is about like wild onion and wild garlic. How would you take care of that?
That is a good question. So it's funny enough, there's a couple of native species that I've actually planted in my landscape that I like because of the flowers, and I like because of the taste. A lot of them are Allium canadense. Var canadense is actually wild meadow garlic, and it can be a weed, especially in areas that maybe are lower lying or tend to stay wet longer. So I would try and taper off the water in those areas. But there are selective herbicides that you could put on those, and they would not um, and they would not kill your turf grass. Off the top of my head, I don't know what herbicide that would be. Onions are in the lily family, so I would think that probably it would be more of the herbicides that are targeted to control like the grassy weeds. So like anything that says crabgrass on there, those bottles with on the instructions, just pull it back and look, and it's got like a Bible. It's like it folds out, but make sure that it has onions on there, and then it would be effective there. I wish I knew off the top of my head, but you also may just Google controlling wild onion in Bermuda grass and type in EDU, and I bet you the answer will pop up right away. And if I had time, I would do it tonight. You may even like tweet at me or Instagram and ask me a question, and I'll try and find out the answer. But that's my best answer I have right now. Sorry.
Oh, perfect. I think that's great. Yeah, I agree. Definitely less water can a lot of times just take care of that completely without any type of chemicals.
Or put them on your baked potato.
There you go. All right. Next question. Can you talk just briefly a little bit more about lawn aeration? And if you're fertilizing, do you need to aerate before you fertilize?
You don't have to. Really, a lawn aeration is only now the people that have the businesses that do that will tell you different. But from a horticulturalist perspective who doesn't have a dog in the fight, generally it's really for heavy compacted clays. So if you've noticed areas in your soil where it's kind of bare and the turf grass is struggling, and maybe that's there was a project done in your home. Like for my colleagues, there was a place where well, heavy wheelbarrows had gone through time and time again in an area, or maybe you have a heavy dog and that's the path that it runs by every time, and you know that you have a heavy clay soil, then it definitely wouldn't hurt. Also, if you have a sloped area or an area where you've seen just the water doesn't want to infiltrate as much, then I think turf aeration is great. And now is the perfect time of year to do it. In terms of fertilizing, you could fertilize after. Some people will fertilize after, and it kind of helps any of that organic matter break down a little bit faster. And if that was something you wanted to do, and also it probably wouldn't hurt for a slow release fertilizer to get down in there. What I probably wouldn't use is a lot of nitrogen fertilizer in a fast release form that would actually go down and be exposed to the root zone because we wouldn't want the roots to get burned. So I would just kind of keep that in mind. But you could fertilize before and then core aerate, or you could use a slow nitrogen fertilizer, maybe even compost and top dress that after.
Okay, sounds good. Next question is about, okay, for folks that have a really small lawn, do you recommend that rotary push mower?
If you have one a finer blade lawn, it works perfectly fine. With St. Augustine, sometimes if you had like a runner, it could be problematic. It kind of gets kind of cut up in there. They have to run very, very smooth. You have to have a uniform lawn in order for those to just cut perfectly. But when they do, it's like magical. It's just like if you've ever run one, they just spin and it cuts all the clippings into very tiny pieces and it's smooth. And when they're running right, it's great. Um, but if there's some runners or you've waited 2 weeks to mow, or there's like a tree ahead and it drops limbs. In my old house, I had a pecan tree that would lose limbs in there, and I would go and pull them all up, and you'd get 90% of them. But yeah, if you run into one, I mean, I'm talking about like a quarter-inch twig, it will stop you dead in your tracks. And so if you imagine, I'm a 300-pound, 6'4" guy, and I'm like trekking it with the real mower, and if it stops me dead in my tracks, that's kind of a an umph. But um, I would try maybe rent one or ask a friend if they have one. I had a Fiskars. It was rated one of the best. I don't sell Fiskars or anything like that, and I thought it worked pretty good. But again, it's kind of just personal preference. There's also for $200 you can get some great battery powered mowers that may be easier depending on the maintenance you want to put in. So yeah. I
Okay.
feel like I kind of dodged that answer, but I don't know that there's a good answer. I
No, I
wouldn't
think
want you to go out
that's
and
good.
buy one and be like, "This sucks. I hate this. This guy lied to me." But there's pluses and minuses.
All right. It looks like we have one more question, and this one's about the rain and freeze sensors you mentioned. So, are there any tips or challenges when it comes to like the average person installing their own?
No, they're relatively easy. In fact, I would kind of figure out which brand you want. There are some that I tend to prefer better that they actually, after the rainfall event, they're dumping it out. There's other ones that have kind of like a little piece of cardboard in there, and periodically you may have to come change that cardboard or just make sure, test it and make sure it's operating properly. Pretty much all of them are, less than 60, $70. They're easy to install. I like YouTube. I watch a lot of YouTube videos, and we make YouTube videos. But I would be cautious to, if you find kind of the ones you think you want, like you could type in best rain and freeze sensor and watch some YouTube videos on the installation. Watch two or three and see if that's something that you want to tackle. It would probably be very inexpensive for an irrigation. You could go to the Irrigation Association. Just type in Irrigation Association Texas, or even TCEQ, the Texas Commission for Environmental Quality, has a database where you can search for licensed irrigators. And if they were going to do an irrigation checkup for you, um, they would probably install a rain and freeze sensor for less than $50. So get a $50 rain and freeze sensor. They're already out there now. Typically they're going to charge $120 to come out, um, just there. But if they're doing other tasks, anytime I hire an electrician or a plumber, I always have 4 or 5 things for them to do, because if it just takes 20 or 30 more minutes to do this one little thing, you're not having to have another house call. So watch a YouTube video, see if it's something you want to tackle. If not, a licensed irrigator would probably do it for relatively cheap.
All right. Well, I think that was our last question, and we've got lots of thank yous in the chat. So you can go ahead and wrap up.
All right. Well, thank y'all so much again for joining us. If you have any questions or you think about anything else, feel free to reach out to us on social media at RootedNTX. Again, you can find a lot more great information at waterisawesome.com and rootedin.com. And I hope y'all have a great rest of the week. Bye bye.